You know that moment when you catch your reflection in a window and by the time you get home, you're Googling meal plans even though you know better? I call those trapdoor moments. And if you've done the food work, you've made peace with eating the cookie, you reject diet culture, but your reflection can still send you spiraling, it's because body image work isn't the same as food work, and you can't skip it. That's exactly why I created the Midlife Body Image Lab. This is a 6-week guided experiment. It's not a course with modules that you'll feel guilty about not finishing. Each week, you'll test an idea, gather your own evidence, and figure out what's keeping body dissatisfaction in the driver's seat. Because if you skip the body work, the food work will always feel harder than it needs to be. Head to the show notes for the link, and let's start closing some trapdoors.
Dopamine is a chemical messenger that's responsible for not just our reward. We often think of it as like the pleasure chemical for reward, but it's also very important in focus and motivation and our emotional regulation part of our brain. And therefore, when estrogen starts to fluctuate, a little bit progesterone, but mainly estrogen, it starts to affect the signalling and how balanced the dopamine signalling is and how stable that is. And therefore, you get that knock-on effect with ADHD.
Welcome to the Midlife Feast, the podcast that helps you make sense of your body, your health, and menopause in the messy middle of midlife. I'm Dr. Jen Salib-Huber, intuitive eating dietitian and naturopathic doctor, and author of Eat to Thrive During Menopause. Around here, we don't see midlife and menopause as problems to solve, but as invitations to live with more freedom, trust, and joy. Each week, you'll hear real conversations and practical strategies to help you feel like yourself again, eat without guilt, and turn midlife from a season of survival into a season of thriving. I'm so glad you're here. Let's dig in. When it comes to ADHD and menopause, it feels like we're just starting to scratch the surface. I've had 2 guests on the podcast before, Dr. Jen Wolkin and Diana Reed, talking about ADHD and menopause and nutrition. And my guest today is a GP, Dr. Helen Wall from England, and she's written a book, which comes out in just a few days, called Menopause and ADHD. But despite the fact that it feels like everyone might be talking about menopause and ADHD, there's still a lot that we don't know. And what we talk about in this conversation is the connection between perimenopause and especially the shift and roller coaster in hormones and how that might influence things like attention, emotional regulation, brain fog. And we talk about how that transition through menopause is uncomfortable for everyone, but how those shifts in hormones might be different in somebody with ADHD or just somebody who falls under that umbrella of neurodivergence. So I think that this conversation really adds to the other 2 that we've already had on the podcast. I certainly learned a lot, and I really appreciate the work that Dr. Wall is doing, and I think that you will all enjoy it too. Welcome to the Midlife Feast, Dr. Wall.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I know that this is going to be a very popular podcast. We've talked about ADHD a couple of times already on the podcast, and they are very well-loved episodes. And I think that one of the things that really drew me to the information that you're sharing about menopause and ADHD is that you're really incorporating the neurodiversity angle, which is both new but not new, because it's always been there. We just haven't been talking about it, right?
Yeah, it's a bit like we didn't see stars until we had telescopes, isn't it? It's always been there for sure. Yeah.
So can you just introduce yourself to the audience and who you are and what you do?
I'm Helen Wall. I'm a GP in England, near Greater Manchester. Well, in Greater Manchester, near Manchester. I have had an interest in women's health for many years. In fact, I was going to do obstetrics and gynecology, and I was pregnant at the time and chose general practice for life reasons. But because of that, I've sort of done women's health through a thread throughout my career as a general practitioner, which I think you may call family medicine over there. And I am incredibly passionate about menopause, perimenopause, hormonal changes in women, because I think it's incredibly underserved, certainly here in the UK. And it's misunderstood, and women are getting dismissed and fobbed off a lot, and that really angers me. And I get quite passionate about that. And I particularly advocate of late, over the last couple of years, for women who are neurodivergent, particularly those who have been misdiagnosed again and mislabeled and left to sort of burn out really and not understand what's going on with them. And I guess that was driven through awareness of my own daughter's neurodivergent journey. She was diagnosed just before she was 17, and sort of that was on secondary to the hormonal changes that happened in puberty. And I started to recognise those things happening in my menopause clinics when I was seeing women in perimenopause. I'm a registered menopause specialist with the British Menopause Society. And I just started to pick up the patterns and do a bit more of a deep dive, went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and here we are.
Yeah, and I feel like, you were one of the first people to be talking, medically and from an evidence-based perspective about the connection between neurodiversity, ADHD, and hormonal changes. And we certainly all appreciate your work. So thank you for sharing all of that. And I've shared a bit about my story that I was diagnosed with ADHD at 19, so not unlike your daughter, and then thought I grew out of it in my late 20s. And, but then when perimenopause, crash landed, as I say, at 37, it came back. I guess the masking really, the cover was blown off of that lid. And it wasn't until I put those pieces together that I realized that, one was really making the other worse. And it was bidirectional. Menopause and perimenopause was making the ADHD more symptomatic and vice versa. But it's also really hard to kind of separate the two. And that's what I hear from a lot of women is they'll say, like, either they have ADHD, but they're not sure if it's an ADHD symptom or if it's a perimenopausal symptom, or they feel like maybe they have ADHD, but they have never been diagnosed and they don't know where to start. So maybe we can start by talking about the connection between ADHD, neurodiversity, and the menopause transition.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that drives me in this space is the fact that we are very much not talking about the effect that female hormones, sex hormones, have on our brains.
Yeah.
Certainly here in the UK, it's almost sort of a non-disclosure topic. I did a conference, I do some speaking events, and I spoke to about 100 clinicians. I'm going slightly off tangent here, but I will come back, don't worry. 100 clinicians.
That's okay. Tangents are always welcome on this podcast.
You find I do this a lot. And I asked all of them before I started talking. I was there to talk about ADHD and menopause and the link between the two. And I started my talk by asking them all, who here during their medical training or their postgrad training, there were nurses, there were pharmacists, there were GPs, clinicians, who was taught about the effect of women's hormones, sex hormones on the brain? Not one person could say they had been. It was like tumbleweed. They all looked at each other, they looked at my screen, they looked at me, they looked at the ceiling. And then I said, who was taught about the effects of sex hormones on periods and reproduction? And of course, they all were. And this is the fundamental flaw, I think, that we are seeing here. We are not talking about these effects. So what actually happens with female sex hormones is they play a major role in the chemical messaging of our brain. And what that means is that if our estrogen and progesterone are fluctuating or dipping, so they fluctuate generally in this phase called perimenopause, which I describe as the journey towards menopause, they wildly and unpredictably fluctuate. And then you get to menopause and the hormones start to decline more stably. That has a knock-on effect on what's going on in our brains. And that's not what we're not talking about. So whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, there's a knock-on effect happening, which is where we get things like brain fog from, that change in our brain where we feel like, whether we're neurotypical or neurodivergent, we feel like our brains are not functioning like they were before. Our emotional regulation can be changed, it can be different. Our ability to fly off the handle or come down from flying off the handle can be significantly different because of those effects of the hormones working on parts of our brain. Now, if we move to a woman who's got ADHD, her brain is effectively wired differently. Parts of the brain are different in function, how they function. The size might be slightly different. The reactivity might be slightly different. So not to go into it too complex a zone, because I'm a GP after all, not a neuroscientist. But essentially what's happening is we've got chemical messengers, mainly things like dopamine, which is very, very important in ADHD, because we know that in women with ADHD that dopamine signaling is different in anyone, not just women. Dopamine signaling is different in ADHD, and dopamine is a chemical messenger that's responsible for not just our reward. We often think of it as like the pleasure chemical for reward, but it's also very important in focus and motivation and our emotional regulation part of our brain. And therefore, when estrogen starts to fluctuate, a little bit progesterone, but mainly estrogen, it starts to affect the signaling and how balanced the dopamine signaling is and how stable that is. And therefore, you get that knock-on effect with ADHD. So that's why women often say, I've gone all through my life and I've managed to cope, and then suddenly the hormones start to change in perimenopause and menopause, and everything comes crashing down because all the masking, all the scaffolding, all the coping strategies can't now hold up the fact that the dopamine signaling has had one further hit from the changes in the hormones. And it's not just dopamine either. It can affect noradrenaline, it can affect serotonin. So loads of different chemical messages in the brain, which then affect how our brain functions. And that's happening in perimenopause to all women. And this is the biggest criticism that I come across. This is just perimenopause, this is just menopause. Why are you trying to stick an ADHD label on it? But they do reach a subsection of women who've been ADHD their whole lives, had ADHD their whole lives, but managed to hide it, often from themselves, not just from other people. They've masked. Not many women haven't even realised they've done this, but they've always felt this thread of something being not quite right.
Yeah.
If you recognise that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the overfunctioning, the perfectionism, that desire to hide the flaws of, I'm not disorganized, I can just do 100 things at once. And that becomes an impossible ask of our brain in perimenopause, and so all of a sudden, these women who have been able to do it all the time for everyone and sacrifice their own needs, but feel like they're doing okay. If you ask them at the time, they feel like they're managing, and then all of a sudden they feel like there's something wrong because they can't maintain that. It feels really like the walls come crashing down, and they feel really broken. Like, that's what I hear. And this syndrome of, not feeling like myself, which we know happens to women across the perimenopause and menopause. All of those symptoms of, my body is changing, I don't feel like I look the same, I'm not sleeping the same, my relationships are changing. And then you layer on top of that, and now I feel like all of my coping strategies are no longer accessible to me, and everyone is going to see what's wrong with me. It just adds such a layer of vulnerability that, it's so hard.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen women who are absolutely in bits, totally and utterly chronically exhausted. And, to go back on the criticism from some people about, well, this is just perimenopause, this is just menopause, why are you trying to add an ADHD label on it? ADHD doesn't turn up in perimenopause and menopause. It unmasks. It's in there all the time. And it's interesting that you said, I got diagnosed at 19 and then I felt like it had gone away in my 20s and then came back in perimenopause. It didn't go away. You just became incredibly brilliant, probably, I'm guessing, at masking. And so good at masking that even you didn't realise yourself that you were doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But what we're not very good at, even if we recognise a woman's been masking, but what we're not good at is, what was the hidden cost to you? What were your hidden costs? And I'm pretty sure that if you were really honest and sat down and thought about that, you could think of some hidden costs. So I'll give you an example. I spoke to a lady who had a really great job. She was flying high to the top of her career path, and to all intents and purposes, she was doing amazing. And I spoke to her and she said, yeah, I am doing amazing. I think that, everybody knows that. And I feel like in my career, I'm doing amazing, but there's so much that I've missed out on because of that. Because she told me that for every meeting that she went into to try and impress people, she would spend 3 hours the night before preparing for that meeting, rehearsing what she was going to say, researching every possible question she would get asked, trying to replay what that was going to look like so that she could go in there and be her best self. And the cost of that was that she had missed out on friendships, she'd missed out on relationships, she had felt isolated at times. And, she was tired. She got to perimenopause and was like, I don't want this life anymore. I've got this amazing life.
Mhm.
But actually, I'm pretty exhausted from doing all of this and I've missed out on so much. And there was a huge sense of grief there. Why had she been able to function like this and not one person had identified that there was something else underlying this? And it's really hard to identify. If you can't identify yourself, you don't go and ask for help, you don't flag it up, then it's a chronic issue in women.
And also our culture rewards productivity.
Yes.
And so if a woman is successful and productive and on the outside looks like she's keeping it all together,
Yep.
we praise that. We say, how do you do it all? Instead of, are you okay?
Yes,
You
absolutely.
know, and when you ask that, are you okay question, it's amazing how often the mask crumbles,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And women and girls have been almost sort of conditioned to do that from a very young age. We see this in primary school children. We see this, little girls going into the classroom and being the people-pleasing perfectionist, the perfect pupil that teachers love to have in class. It's very, very common that I'll see parents come to me and say, there's something going on with my child. They're in school, the teacher says they're perfect, they're getting great reports, that they're not often doing, they're often showing some signs of inattentiveness in that they're not perhaps keeping up with the work like you would expect them to. But from a behaviour and from a personable side, they're absolutely amazing. And then they get home through the front door and they completely go into meltdown,
Yeah.
tantrums, screaming, crying, can't the parents are at their wits' end, they don't know why they've got this child that's sort of two different people. And obviously that can be for many reasons, but one of the reasons can be that little girl could be masking at school. And the difficulty we then have is, as GPs, I don't know what it's like where you are, but as GPs in England, most areas advise us to not refer the child in for an ADHD assessment. We're asked to send them to the school for the school to do that. That's the pathway. And of course, the parents go to school and say, I think my child might have ADHD. And the school say, absolutely not. There's no evidence of that whatsoever because they're perfectly well behaved. Because we're still thinking about ADHD in education systems, in society, in workplaces, as that hyperactive boy that's disruptive, that's, throwing chairs around the classroom,
Yeah.
doing all the things that you'd expect from being really, hyper. We're not thinking about it in the sense that most women and girls have that internalized hyperactivity, that restlessness inside them, that inattentiveness, that inability to switch tasks and focus effectively. And a huge part of ADHD in women and girls is emotional regulation and the ability to emotional regulate. So, yeah, I think, we've got a long, long way to go to get everybody on board with this.
And it's interesting you mentioned the difference between girls and boys. I have 3 kids. 2 of my kids have an ADHD diagnosis. One is a girl, one is a boy. And their presentations could not have been more different. And it's very easy for me to see in hindsight how my daughter's diagnosis was missed until she was 13. Whereas my son's was obvious from the time he was 2, because he really fits that stereotype of, we used to joke that he was a dog that needed to be walked. Like he was literally the kid that we were like, 20 minutes sitting in a chair, that's not going to work. Right. Whereas with my daughter, she really didn't have any effects from her ADHD until she hit junior high school. And then the focus and the sustained focus that was required became too hard for her to mask. So that's interesting. I want to talk about the hormones and the brain. And Dr. Sarah Mackay was on the podcast earlier this year and, brilliantly was talking about how our brain goes through this remodeling in menopause. And so the brain fog that we experience is kind of the connections being dropped, but then being picked up on the other side. And I'd love to hear how you explain, because I've seen you do this on social media so well, how estrogen and progesterone influence not only our brain function, but also that relationship with dopamine.
Yeah, it really does. And again, this is something we really don't talk about enough. So, in the simplest terms, you could say estrogen boosts dopamine, and that's not scientifically correct. It's a very, very simplistic version of it. But I think it helps just get our heads around, in the simplistic way, why we need estrogen, and why we need it to be relatively stable, because it's almost as if it's as difficult for it to be fluctuating as it is to be low. For a long time we spoke about menopause when we knew estrogen had dipped, and that's when we sort of focused on the period of life where women's periods had stopped, their estrogen was low, they're in menopause. But now we focus a lot on this period of time in perimenopause when the hormones are rapidly fluctuating and volatile. And that has a very destabilizing effect on our dopamine levels in our brain, but not just our dopamine levels, all chemical messages in our brain, serotonin, which is what we get in antidepressants, and and other chemicals. So if we have estrogen that is changing rapidly, then you're going to see effects, and those effects in real terms, in terms of what we see, can be the brain fog, the executive dysfunction, where you can't sort of piece together what's going on, plan something, process, move from task to task. I mean, all of this, I'm perimenopausal, all of this sounds extremely familiar to me as well. It is really challenging. And the thing with progesterone as well, progesterone is actually often the first hormone that drops in perimenopause. Again, something we don't really talk about much here in the UK. We tend to very much focus on estrogen and getting estrogen back into women and stabilising the estrogen. But progesterone, we know, is often the first hormone to drop in early perimenopause. And what progesterone does is it converts to something called allopregnolone, which is a neurosteroid. And allopregnolone works on our GABA receptors in our brain. Now, your GABA receptors, GABA A receptors, are those receptors whereby if you take a diazepam or have that first glass of wine or a sedative, it hits those receptors and causes a very calming effect. Now, if you have progesterone, that should cause that same calming effect. Now, if you remove that early doors in perimenopause, it's not surprising that many women initially, when they start going into early perimenopause, the first thing they notice is that they feel more anxious. How many times have we heard women in their late 30s, early 40s say, I just suddenly feel all anxious. I've never been anxious in my life, but suddenly I can't do the same things I was going to do. I'm waking up in the night, that 3 a.m. wake up where you're like, what have where's my birth certificate? You don't even need your birth certificate. You haven't had a birth certificate for 40 years, but suddenly you need to know where it is at 3 a.m. in the morning. Probably because, your progesterone's fluctuating, dipping, whatever, and you're just seeing the effects. So there's a lot of effects that happen from estrogen and progesterone fluctuate. I've just touched the surface there. You can go into so much, you can absolutely go down a rabbit hole with this, but I think the key message is we need to talk more about the effects that hormones have on our brains. That's my key message throughout all of this. And that's the same whether you're a neurotypical woman or neurodivergent woman. Interestingly, I think the other thing that we perhaps don't maybe focus on enough is that neurodivergent women often have an altered response to progesterone. So, and this can happen in any woman, but it's more common in neurodivergent women. That calming effect of allopregnolone that happens on our GABA A receptors in some women can have a paradoxical effect. So instead of being calming, it can be very agitating, and women can become very overstimulated, agitated, very sensitive once the progesterone rises. And that tends to happen in the second half of our cycle. And that's where we think we see and why we see things like PMDD occur. And PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, is far more not popular, what's the word? See, I am perimenopausal, I'm proving this. Common, far more common in women with ADHD. There is a definite overlap between, I think it's about 30 to 40% of women with ADHD will also have PMDD, which is huge.
Huge.
PMDD is so PMDD is not premenstrual syndrome where you feel a little bit out of sorts before your period, or you feel anxious or moody, which can be very debilitating. PMDD is, I think, something like 80% of women with PMDD have at some point in their lives attempted or thought about suicide.
Yeah, it's very severe.
It's critical. So, there's a huge area of hormones and how they work on the brain, either positively or negatively, that I don't think we incorporate into everyday practice nearly enough.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you brought up about the progesterone sensitivity. I've shared many times on the podcast. I've written about it in my book. And it was really the reason why I started looking at alternatives, because I, like so many others in perimenopause, tried hormone therapy. And because I have a uterus, I needed the progesterone component. And the side effects were so severe, and they were all neurological, mental, emotional. It impacted my mood and anxiety so severely that I absolutely could not continue with it. And it's so interesting when I share that, how often I hear from people. So it's not uncommon. I think it's not by far. I don't know what the stats are. Maybe you do, but I feel like, most women tolerate it great. I have a sister who loves her progesterone. She takes it cyclically and counts down until she can start it. She loves it so much. And then there are others who, just really feel like it makes everything worse. And so understanding that there is a difference in how our brains respond to it, I think is really validating.
Yeah.
And makes us feel like, okay, it's not just me. I'm not broken. This is just how my brain is wired, right?
And that's exactly it. It's not, and this is what my book is about, really. It's not about making excuses. It's not about trying to diagnose people that aren't, you're just trying to diagnose everyone with ADHD. Absolutely not. I'm trying to give women the information so that they can have that validation, really, and understand what's going on for them, so that they can then feel like they can have some control over it. Because I think the position that I see so many women in is that they just feel totally out of control, because all these things are happening to them and they don't understand, they can't get a grip of it. And, women with ADHD in particular, I think this affects all women to some extent, but they're very good at self-blame and self-loathing. Everything that comes on them. It's their fault. Why can't they just get on with it? Why can't they just get... And so many times I've heard women say, I've got a great life. Why can't I just enjoy it? But if your brain is completely unraveling because your chemical messengers are all over the place, because your hormones are all over the place, that's not on you. That is a neurobiological process. And the self-blame serves only one thing, and that is to make you feel worse. You're not getting anything positive out of that. You're just going to feel worse. So I think providing that understanding about what's actually going on, and therefore the validation, can help ease some of that self-blame, and therefore that can be therapy in itself, really, for a lot of women.
Yeah, the self-compassion is definitely something we need on the menu. So what has been studied, or what are options that might help somebody who either knows they have ADHD or is newly diagnosed and is going through this transition? What are some of the things that might help them?
So I think obviously there's the medical route that you can go down. The medical route in the UK is pretty tough, I'll be honest. I don't know what it's like where you are, but
Next.
Yeah, the wait times are, if you want an ADHD adult assessment on the NHS, you're looking probably on average about 3 to 4 years wait.
Wow.
Yeah, it can be quicker in some areas, but it's a bit of a postcode lottery. So you do have to be, resilient, and it's not great. You can go to private providers, but ultimately, if you need to decide whether that's a process you want to get into if you're already feeling burnt out and worn out. You could end up on medication, but I don't believe medication for ADHD is the be-all and end-all. I think it really helps some women, absolutely. And I think if you're somebody who's constantly, throughout your life struggled with focus and attention and, the brain moving from task to task, etc., then I think you could possibly get some benefit from that. You can, much easier in the UK, is to stabilise the hormones if it is as if it has become much worse because of perimenopause or menopause and HRT. Whilst there's no direct studies on HRT and ADHD, because we're not very good at studying things in women or neurodivergence, we know anecdotally that stabilising the hormones can have a helpful effect to many women. Particularly if you're a woman who's previously masked, like yourself, who said, it went away. Well, you probably didn't go away. You probably masked really well, and it was the hormones changing that stopped that being able to happen. So if we can stabilize those hormones, then theoretically we can put you back into that state where you can put your scaffolding back up effectively. But a large part of my book centres on not just about the medical path, so not just about medication for ADHD or medication for hormones, about sort of that understanding your brain and why you're feeling like this and what is actually going on. And there's plenty of tips and tricks in there for how you can try and do that. So some things you'll have heard of if you're well versed in ADHD. Externalizing the brain is a huge one, and I'm a huge believer in externalizing the brain. I can't keep anything in my brain for very long. I have notebook. I'm sat here now. I've got about 4 notebooks on my desk. Literally, they're all over the place. I have a whole bag just for my notebooks for different things. So I write everything down. It works.
I'm the same way. Yeah.
If anybody wants to buy me a present, a notebook would be great.
And sticky notes. I would die without sticky notes.
Yeah. That's sort of, I think, as we've said, just the validation is very therapeutic in itself. And in my book, I talk about setting boundaries. So I see a lot of patients who have grown up being told they're too lazy, they're too scatty, they're too dippy, they can't get on, they can't concentrate, they're too uptight. And just sort of having that validation to go, actually, this is me, this is my brain, this is how I function, and I've been swimming against this tide because, let's face it, most of education, most of workplaces are set up for the neurotypical brain. So just by being there, you're swimming against the tide in terms of what's set up for you, and being able to set those boundaries and say, actually, I don't need this in my life. I don't want that. I'm going to do it my way, and being okay with that. So we talk a lot about how to sort of set your boundaries and not be sort of get rid of that people pleasing, really, that I think so many women are good at doing, but ultimately it has a huge cost to them.
Yeah.
So there's a few different things in there. There's nervous system regulation, the emotional regulation in a woman's brain because of the changes in hormones, but also that the effect then on the chemical messenger systems can be really hard part of ADHD for women, especially ADHD for women in perimenopause and menopause. It can be hugely disabling for relationships, workplaces.
Absolutely.
So again, a bit about how to sleep better, how to downregulate your nervous system when you're feeling het up and all this. So it's just trying to arm women really with the tools to see themselves for what's really going on and know how to do something to help move them forwards. Absolutely, if you can do that whether you're on medication or not. But I wanted to provide something for those women who didn't want or couldn't have medication, or simply who are going to wait a long time before they get to that point.
Yeah. So I am so excited for your book. So please tell us. It comes out on May 14th. Tell us what it's called and where people can find it.
It's called ADHD and Menopause, and it's published by Penguin. So it should be on all bookshops, really, but it's certainly out on Amazon. Other stores are available. They're not supposed to advertise. Basically, you can Google it and it's there. It's on pre-order now, and it's out on the 14th. So I hope it's going to help some women because things need to change, and I think I hope this is just the beginning of that change happening. I really, really don't want my daughter to get to perimenopause and menopause and things not be better than they are now.
Well, it is a much needed book. I am very much looking forward to it. I thank you so much for your work, your book, but also your work online. And so where can people find you if they want to start following you and learning more about you?
So I'm on Instagram at Dr. Helen Wall, the full word doctor, because someone else had nicked the DR version. before I got there. And I'm also on Facebook as well, Dr. Helen Wall. And I have a website, www.drhelenwall.com. So fairly easy. Just put my name in, basically. You'll find me.
We'll have all those links in the show notes. So as I always ask my guests at the end, what do you think is the missing ingredient in midlife?
I'm going to say persistence, because I think by the time we get to midlife, I think we're a bit worn down because we've put up with so much rubbish throughout everything, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. You know, women put up with a lot in terms of the load that we take on, the mental load, the people pleasing, the trying to be all things to all people. And when they get to that point in life, they then often don't persist with the medical teams. They feel like, you know, when they get fobbed off or dismissed, they think it's them, just self-loathe, self-blame. It's not me. I shouldn't be there. I shouldn't be bothering them. Persist. You know, if you don't get the help you need, keep going back, because it's not you. It really is not you. The system, I hope I've managed to show women that we've not got it all together yet in terms of healthcare and women's hormones. We're a long, long way from that. So don't be fobbed off. Don't be put off by thinking that you're just in the wrong, because I'm almost certain you won't be.
Thank you so much for your time today and for your work.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Midlife Feast. If you're ready to take the next step towards thriving in midlife, head to menopausenutritionist.ca to learn more about my one-to-one and group coaching programs, free resources, and where to get your copy of Eat to Thrive during menopause. And if you've loved today's conversation and found it helpful, please share it with a friend who needs to hear this, and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps so many more people just like you find their way to food freedom and midlife confidence. Until next time, remember, midlife is not the end of the story, it's the feast. Let's savor it together.